The survey drones arrived in the dying light of what the Varric called the second cooling, a period of atmospheric stabilization that, by their calculations, had rendered the third planet from the yellow dwarf uninhabitable for the dominant primate species approximately 412 years prior. That was the number their models agreed on, 412 years. Survey Commander Thesek had no reason to doubt the models. She was crouched over the portable holographic table in the forward camp, watching the drone feeds paint a picture of the dead city in real time. Her crew had made camp on the overgrown roof of a structure that their linguistic AI had tentatively translated as a shopping center, a place where the hairless primates had exchanged tokens for material goods. The roof had held, most of the interior had not. Species designation Homo sapiens, said her science officer. You're all, reading from the survey file without looking up. He had 3 eyes and used all of them simultaneously. A habit Thesek had spent 11 years, learning not to find unnerving. Bipedal endothermic, approximately 1.6 to 1.9 meters in height. Extraordinary neural complexity relative to body mass. Tool use documented as far back as 3 million years by our earlier survey. He paused. Extinct as of 412 years ago. Cause of extinction, multifactor cascade. Atmospheric destabilization, resource depletion, political fragmentation, and, he tilted his head, they appear to have been at war with each other when the end came. At war with each other, Thesek repeated, extensively documented. Ural tapped his data tablet, and a holographic web of historical timelines expanded above the table. Thousands of conflicts overlapping like scar tissue. They were quite good at it. Thesek studied the empty skyline beyond the camp's perimeter. The city had been called Sao Paulo. It had, according to the archived records, her ship had pulled from the decaying satellite network still orbiting, in low gravity, been home to 12 million of the creatures. She tried to hold that number in her mind and found she couldn't. 12 million. Gone. Along with 8 billion others. Begin grid survey, she said. I want tissue samples from the burial sites, structural integrity reports on all standing architecture, and a full catalog of the material culture. The Council wants a comprehensive extinction record. Understood, Commander. She didn't go to sleep that night. She stood at the edge of the rooftop and looked at the forest that had swallowed the lower thirds of the buildings. Vines thick as her forearm, trees whose roots had cracked the pavement into a mosaic of broken stone and dark soil, birds that shouldn't have been able to survive at this altitude, wheeling between the towers in loose, unconcerned spirals. The planet was healing. She had seen it before on other survey missions. Nature, given enough time, always reclaimed what civilization had borrowed from it. She was thinking about the 12 million when the motion sensors fired. The alarm was a soft chime, not danger, just movement, something large and warm-blooded crossing the perimeter at the southeast corner. Thesek didn't wake the camp. She picked up her scanner and walked toward it alone. She told herself later that she had expected an animal, a large one, perhaps. The mammalian megafauna were making a cautious return in the absence of the apex predator that had previously competed with them for territory. The scanner showed a heat signature that was large but not enormous, bipedal. Moving carefully, deliberately, staying low. She told herself she had expected an animal. She stepped around the collapse edge of a rooftop access structure, raised her scanner, and found herself looking at a human being. The creature was perhaps 60 years old by the biological indicators, though she would later revise that estimate upwards significantly. It was male, lean to the point of severity, dressed in layers of salvaged fabric that had been repaired so many times the original material was nearly impossible to identify. It had a beard that had gone entirely gray, and eyes the color of old iron. In one hand it carried a long-handled tool that might have been a weapon and might have been a farming implement. Possibly both. It was looking directly at her. Neither of them moved. Thesek later tried to reconstruct her exact emotional state in that moment for her report. She had written, initial response consistent with perceptual error. I assumed instrument malfunction. That was accurate as far as it went. What she had not written, because she wasn't certain the council would understand, was that her second response had been something close to awe. She was looking at something that shouldn't exist, something the models, the data, the satellite surveys, the atmospheric readings, and 400 years of comfortable scientific consensus said was gone. The human spoke first. She didn't understand the words. Her linguistic AI scrambled to process them against the archived language files. There were thousands of human languages cataloged, most of them dead, and after a moment, quietly it gave her a translation. He had said, "You're not what I expected." She activated her translation module and said slowly, in what the AI had identified as the most widely spoken of the archived human languages, "We believed you were extinct." The old man's expression did something complicated. It wasn't quite a smile, and it wasn't quite grief, and it was something she didn't have a word for in her own language. "Yeah," he said, "we get that a lot." His name was Paulo. He took her to the others the following morning, after a night during which neither of them slept, and both of them sat on opposite sides of a small fire he had built from materials she couldn't identify, and talked in fits and starts, her AI translating frantically, occasionally getting things wrong in ways that made him make a short, exhaled sound she eventually identified as laughter. There were 381 of them in the settlement he led her to. It was built into the lower levels of what had once been an office tower, reinforced with salvaged steel and living wood, the kind of structure that didn't look like much from the outside, and turned out, once you were inside, to be a small civilization. They had food stores, they had a water system, they had children, a dozen of them, small and serious-eyed, who stared at Thesek from around corners and door frames with a caution that was clearly learned rather than instinctive. They had survived. The how of it was what Paulo spent the next several days explaining to her in the afternoons when the settlement's work allowed him time. The answer, like all honest answers to complex questions, was not simple. Some of them were descendants of people who had been underground when the worst of it came, subway workers, miners, construction crews who had been doing their jobs in the deep places when the world above them changed. Some were from high-altitude communities that the cascade had struck last and least severely. Some were simply the product of a particular kind of stubbornness that seemed to be woven deep into the species. People who had refused, despite all evidence, to accept that there was no path forward. "We've been rebuilding for about 200 years, Paulo said one afternoon, sitting in the light that came through a carefully engineered gap in the tower's cladding. "Slowly. We're careful about it. We learned." He stopped, started again. "The old ones learned. What they passed on to us was, don't repeat the things that broke it." "And do you," Thesek asked, "repeat them?" He was quiet for a moment. "Some. Less than before." He looked at his hands, which were scarred in ways she had come to understand, were the marks of heavy, long-continued work. "We're slower learners than we'd like to be." She went back to her camp that evening and wrote in her survey log for 2 hours. Then she stopped and stared at what she'd written. She had come here to document an extinction. The council's response, when she transmitted her initial report, took 17 days to arrive, given the transmission distance. When it came, it was 200 words long and could be summarized as, "Confirm findings and continue survey, pending further assessment." She had expected that. What she had not expected was the secondary transmission that arrived 4 days later, marked with the classification codes of the Council's strategic division. She read it 3 times before she fully understood what it said. The Varek had encountered species extinction events before. They had a protocol for planets where a dominant intelligence had destroyed itself. It involved documentation, cataloging, and, in cases where the surviving biosphere was considered viable, a process of ecological stewardship. The protocol did not include provisions for survivors. The protocol had not been written with the assumption that there would be any. What the Strategic Division's transmission said, stripped of its formal language, was this: a living remnant population of a previously designated extinct species presents a legal and territorial complexity that must be resolved. Planet designated for ecological stewardship. Remnant population is an obstacle to this designation. She had read enough council legal code to understand what obstacle meant in that context. She sat alone in her command tent for a long time. Then she went to find Paolo. She didn't tell him everything. She told him enough. He was quiet for a longer time than she had yet seen from him when she finished. The settlement's evening sounds moved around them. The particular domestic music of a small community managing itself, which she had learned to hear as distinct from silence. Children's voices somewhere. The rhythmic sound of someone working metal. "How long?" he said at last. "The assessment team will arrive in 32 days. Their mandate will be to confirm population viability, the number of you, your health indicators, whether the population is sustainable. If they find the numbers sufficient, then we become a problem to be managed." She didn't answer. Paolo looked at the ceiling. It was reinforced concrete, pre-extinction, still doing its job 300 years later. "Our ancestors built things that lasted," he said. "Then what would it take to not be an obstacle?" She had thought about this on the walk over. The protocol exists to manage uninhabited planets. A planet with a viable, organized, technologically active civilization cannot be designated for stewardship without a different class of council review. One that requires full, deliberative process, public record, multiple approval stages. It would take years, decades possibly. And what makes a civilization technologically active? By council definition. She paused. This was the part she had rehearsed. Active space capability, communication array, power generation above subsistence level, evidence of organized knowledge transmission. She looked at him steadily. If you had any of those things, the assessment team would be required to file under a completely different protocol. The silence stretched out. "We have a few things," Paolo said slowly. "We've been careful about what we rebuild and what we leave alone. But," he exhaled, 32 days is not much time." "No," she agreed, "it isn't." He looked at her with the iron-gray eyes. "Why are you telling me this?" She thought about how to answer that. She thought about the 12 million she'd tried to hold in her mind from the rooftop of the dead shopping center, and how she had been unable to. She thought about 381 people who had refused, across 200 years of extraordinary difficulty, to accept the version of the future that all the models agreed on. "Because," she said, "I came here to document an extinction. And I would like to write a different report, 32 days. She learned later, much later, when the story had been told enough to acquire the smooth, simplified shape that stories get, that the humans had always been working on the communications array, had been working on it for 11 years. It was the project of the settlement's previous leader, Paolo's mother, who had started it in the belief that sooner or later someone would be listening. The array had been built from salvaged satellite components, pre-extinction electronics, and a great deal of materials science that the settlement's engineers had worked out from first principles over 3 generations of careful experiment. It needed a power source. That was what it had always lacked. Thessek's survey equipment ran on a Varric power cell that was, by the standards of her civilization, small and portable. By the standards of a human settlement that had been running on wind and chemical energy for 2 centuries, it was essentially a star. She classified the equipment transfer as a survey instrument loan in her logs. Her science officer, Ural, looked at her for a very long time when she told him what she had done, and then, very deliberately, did not ask any questions. The array went live on the 28th day. It broadcast on 17 frequencies simultaneously in a signal pattern that the Council's assessment protocol defined unambiguously as evidence of organized technological civilization. The assessment team arrived on the 32nd day, as scheduled. Their lead officer reviewed the array, the power source, the settlement's food production data, its population records, its knowledge archives. 381 people, organized, viable, broadcasting to the stars, and filed, as required by protocol, under the correct designation, not an extinction event, not an obstacle, a first contact. The deliberative process took 19 years. Paolo was 81 when it concluded. He was still lean, still iron-eyed, still possessed of the particular quality she had noticed in that first moment on the rooftop, the quality of someone who had looked at the available evidence and decided, regardless of what it said, to remain. The settlement had grown. It was a town now by any reasonable measure. 2,000 people. 3 satellite communities. Children who had grown up with Varec science and human stubbornness in roughly equal measure, which produced an educational culture that Thesic, who had returned for each of the major assessment reviews and stayed longer each time, found genuinely extraordinary. She was there the day the council's final ruling arrived. She watched Paolo read it. She watched his face do the thing it did when he was containing an emotion that he considered too large to release in public. A slight tightening around the eyes, a particular stillness. Protected status, he said. Recognized sovereignty. Right to self-governance and self-determination. He looked up. They're calling us a rediscovery. The technical term, she said, is unprecedented. The corner of his mouth moved. We're good at that. The celebration that evening was built around a fire, which she had come to understand was the human way of marking that something mattered. She sat at its edge and watched them. The old ones, who carried the memory of how bad it had been, and the young ones, who carried the memory of how it could be better, and all the ones in between, who were the actual work of getting from one to the other. The children played in the firelight with the unconcerned energy of beings who did not know yet what it meant to be a species that had almost not made it. They would learn. They would be told. It would be important to them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, they just ran and called to each other in the warm dark, and the sound of it went up into the same sky that the survey drones had flown through 19 years ago, looking for what was left. They had found more than they came for. They had found what would not die. Thesic's final survey report, filed on the day of the council's ruling, concluded with an addendum she had not been required to write but had written anyway. It said, "The Varec have documented 114 planetary extinction events. We have grown, I think, too comfortable with that documentation. We have learned to arrive after, to catalog the silence, to write careful reports about what was lost. We have forgotten to account for the possibility that some things do not finish losing. Homo sapiens are not a case study in extinction. They are a case study in what extinction cannot do to something that has decided, at a cellular and cultural level, simply not to be done. I have spent 19 years amending my initial assessment. I am aware that I may spend 19 more. I find I do not mind. They are difficult to classify. They are more difficult to stop. In 400 years of what the models called absence, they kept their fires burning in the deep places and waited for someone to notice. I noticed. I am glad I noticed.